In a house where she was once a wife, she was reduced to a housemaid by her powerful mother-in-law. But behind her silence was a plan no one saw coming. What started as humiliation turned into a shocking revenge that exposed hidden secrets, betrayal, and lies inside the family. Disclaimer. This is a fictional story created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. When I first married Daniel Morrison, I truly believed I was stepping into a new life filled with love, respect, and stability. He was everything a person could hope for, on the surface successful, composed, and admired in business circles. His family was known across the city, not just for wealth, but for influence that reached into industries I had never even imagined before. Coming from a modest background where my mother worked as a school teacher, and my father had passed away when I was young, I often felt like I was entering a world that did not naturally belong to me. Still, Daniel never made me feel small in those early days. He spoke to me with kindness, treated me gently, and promised that our life together would be different from the rigid expectations of his world. I held on to that promise tightly because it felt like the only thing keeping me steady in an unfamiliar environment. The Morrison mansion, where I moved after the wedding, was overwhelming in every possible way. It was not just large. It felt like a structure designed to remind everyone inside of its power. The marble floors reflected the light in a way that made everything look perfect, but distant. The hallways were lined with paintings of ancestors who seemed to watch silently, as if judging every step I took. The staff moved quickly and quietly, trained to avoid attention unless spoken to. Even the air inside felt controlled, like everything had its place and nothing was allowed to disturb it. On my first night there, I remember standing in the center of my new room, realizing how quiet it was compared to my old home. That silence should have felt peaceful, but instead it felt heavy, almost like pressure pressing down on me from all sides. It did not take long for me to understand that the real authority in the house was not Daniel, but his mother, Victoria Morrison. She carried herself with an unshakable confidence, the kind that came from years of being obeyed without question. The first time I met her alone, she looked me up and down as if assessing an object rather than a person. Her expression barely changed, but her eyes carried a sharpness that made me feel exposed. She spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words, but each sentence felt designed to remind me that I was an outsider. She did not raise her voice, yet her calmness itself felt like a warning. It was clear from that moment that she had already formed an opinion about me, and that opinion was not going to change easily. At first, I tried everything to fit in. I learned the household routines, remembered every preference Daniel had, and tried to be respectful to everyone around me, including the staff. I believed that if I showed enough patience and kindness, Victoria would eventually accept me. I would wake up early, offer help in small ways, and avoid any behavior that might be seen as disrespectful. Daniel noticed my efforts and reassured me whenever he could, but his work kept him away from the house more often than not. Each time he left for business trips or meetings, the atmosphere in the mansion seemed to shift slightly, as if something inside the walls became more alert and less forgiving. Victoria never openly insulted me in the beginning, but her disapproval was constant and suffocating. She would correct small things I did, question my choices, and often speak about traditions I was expected to follow without explanation. She made it clear that I was expected to adapt completely, not the other way around. Over time, I started noticing how others in the house reacted to her presence. The staff became more careful when she was around, and conversations would stop the moment she entered a room. It was not fear exactly, but something close to it, an awareness that she controlled the emotional climate of the house. Despite everything, I still believed that marriage meant unity and that love could overcome distance and tension. I held on to Daniel's words and convinced myself that things would improve once we settled into routine. But deep inside, I began to feel a growing sense of isolation. I was physically present in a grand home filled with people, yet emotionally, I felt like I was standing outside looking in. Every day blurred into the next. And slowly, I began to understand that I was no longer just adapting to a new family. I was trying to survive inside it without losing myself. As time passed, the initial hope I carried into the Morrison household began to weaken, replaced slowly by a quiet, persistent pressure that never seemed to leave me. The house, which once felt merely unfamiliar, now started to feel deliberately isolating. Daniel's absence became more frequent, and with each trip he took for business, the emotional distance between my life and his world seemed to widen. He would call when he could, asking if everything was fine, and I would always answer the same way, saying that everything was fine, because I did not yet have the courage to explain what was really happening inside the house. I feared that if I spoke too early, I would be seen as someone who could not adjust, someone who misunderstood the complexity of his family. So I stayed quiet, believing that silence was temporary and things would eventually settle. Victoria, however, did not need time to reveal her true intentions. Her behavior toward me became more direct, more calculated. It was no longer just subtle corrections or cold looks. It turned into control. She began to dictate how I spent my day, what I wore, and even how I interacted with the household staff. Every action of mine seemed to be observed, and every mistake, no matter how small, was used as proof that I did not belong. The staff, once polite, began to distance themselves from me. It was not their fault. They were clearly responding to unspoken pressure. In that house, Victoria's approval meant safety, and her disapproval meant consequences. One morning, everything changed in a way I could never have predicted. I was called into the main hall, where Victoria was sitting with a calm expression that immediately made me uneasy. She did not look angry. Instead, she looked certain, as if she had already decided everything that was about to happen. Without asking me to sit, or even acknowledging my confusion, she instructed one of the maids to bring something forward. Within moments, a neatly folded uniform was placed in front of me. I remember staring at it, not understanding what it meant at first. It was a maid's uniform, plain and unmistakable in its meaning. Victoria leaned back slightly and finally spoke in a voice that was calm but sharp enough to cut through the silence. She told me that I had failed to understand my place in the house, that I had confused kindness with entitlement, and that it was time I accepted reality. Then she said the words that stayed with me far longer than anything else she had ever said. She said, "You're just a housemaid now." The sentence was delivered with such certainty that it felt less like an insult and more like a decision already approved by the world around her. I stood frozen, feeling every pair of eyes in the room fixed on me. No one spoke. No one intervened. The silence made the moment heavier than the words themselves. My first instinct was to look for Daniel, but he was not there. That absence mattered more than anything else. If he had been present, perhaps the moment would have been different, or at least delayed. But in his absence, Victoria's authority filled every corner of the room. I felt a sharp mix of shock and disbelief, followed quickly by something deeper and more painful humiliation. It was not just about being insulted. It was about being redefined in front of others, stripped of identity in a place where I had once believed I was building a life. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to ask how things had reached this point. But no words came out. My throat felt tight and my thoughts were scattered. I could see the satisfaction in Victoria's expression, not loud or obvious, but present in the way she watched me struggle silently. It was clear that she had been waiting for this moment, not just to humiliate me, but to establish a permanent place for me within the hierarchy she controlled so effortlessly. The staff avoided my gaze. No one offered comfort or resistance. It became obvious that they had already adjusted to her decision before I even had time to process it. That realization hurt more than the insult itself. It meant that in their eyes, my position had already shifted long before this moment was made official. I stood there holding on to the last thread of my dignity, trying to understand whether this was truly happening or if I was somehow trapped in a situation that could still be reversed. But the expression on Victoria's face left no room for doubt. This was not a misunderstanding or an emotional outburst. It was a declaration of control, and it marked a turning point that would redefine everything I believed about my place in that house and the people who lived inside it. After that day, Something inside me changed in a way that was not visible on the surface, but very real in how I began to think and observe everything around me. I accepted the uniform, not because I agreed with what Victoria had done, but because I realized that resisting openly in that moment would only give her more power over me. From that point forward, I stopped reacting emotionally to her insults. I became quiet, controlled, and carefully invisible. On the outside, I was the same woman wearing a maid's uniform, performing chores that were now expected of me. But on the inside, I was no longer the same person who had entered that house believing in patience and blind loyalty. I had started paying attention to everything. The house, which once felt like a prison of silence, slowly turned into a place of information. I began to notice patterns in Victoria's behavior that I had ignored before. She was not just cruel for personal satisfaction, she was strategic. She spoke to certain staff members privately for long periods. She made decisions on behalf of Daniel's business matters, even though she never held an official position. She had access to files, phone calls, and meetings that were supposed to be confidential. At first, I thought I was misunderstanding things. But the more I observed, the clearer it became that she was deeply involved in controlling more than just the household. I started keeping mental notes of everything I saw and heard. When I cleaned rooms, I paid attention to documents left open on desks. When I served meals, I carefully observed conversations that took place at the dining table. I never interrupted, never questioned, and never allowed my expressions to reveal what I was thinking. Victoria believed she had broken me, and in a way, I allowed her to believe that. That belief gave me access to spaces and information she would never have shared if she thought I was still a threat. Over time, I noticed something even more alarming. Some of Daniel's business documents were being handled in the house itself. Papers were being signed and moved without his presence. At first, I assumed they were minor administrative tasks, but then I started recognizing inconsistencies. Signatures that did not look like Daniel's usual handwriting. Financial records that seemed altered. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Each small detail added to a larger picture that was becoming harder to ignore. I also began observing Victoria's private conversations. She often spoke in low tones on the phone late at night, walking through hallways when she thought everyone was asleep. One evening, while pretending to clean nearby, I overheard her discussing investments and approvals that should have required Daniel's direct authorization. The tone of her voice was not uncertain. It was confident, as if she had already taken control of decisions that did not belong to her. That was the moment I realized this situation was not just about personal cruelty. It was about power and control over something much larger than the household itself. Instead of confronting her or rushing to tell Daniel immediately, I made a difficult decision. I chose to gather information quietly. I understood that without clear evidence, my words would mean nothing against her influence. So I began recording patterns in my mind, remembering dates, times, and details of conversations. When I had access to written materials, I memorized key points. When I was near phones or documents, I paid attention to names and numbers. It was exhausting to remain constantly alert. But I knew that showing impatience would ruin everything I was beginning to understand. Victoria never suspected a thing. To her, I was still the defeated woman she had reduced to a housemaid. She even began to treat me with a kind of dismissive comfort, as if I was no longer worth her attention. That was the exact position I needed to be in. Invisible, underestimated, and ignored. It gave me the space to observe freely without interruption. At night, when the house became quiet, I would sit alone and mentally connect the pieces I had collected throughout the day. Slowly, a disturbing structure began to form in my mind. Victoria was not just influencing the household. She was positioning herself inside Daniel's professional world in a way that could potentially replace his authority entirely if left unchecked. Every action she took seemed calculated to expand her control step by step without raising suspicion. What disturbed me most was not only what she was doing, but how easily she was doing it. No one questioned her. No one stopped her. The system inside the house, and possibly even inside the business, had already started adjusting to her presence, as if she were the center of authority. That realization made me understand that this was no longer just a personal conflict between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. It was something far more serious developing in silence, and I was the only one who had started to see its shape forming clearly enough to understand what it could become if left unchecked. The evening of the dinner arrived with a sense of importance that could be felt even before the guests started arriving. The Morrison mansion, usually cold and controlled, had transformed into something almost theatrical. Lights were brighter, tables were decorated with expensive arrangements, and staff moved faster than usual to prepare for the arrival of influential guests. It was clear that this was not an ordinary family dinner. Business partners, investors, and people who held power in Daniel's professional world were coming together under one roof. For Victoria, this was not just a social gathering. It was an opportunity to present herself in full control of everything connected to the Morrison name. I was assigned my usual duties, but the atmosphere made everything feel heavier. Wearing the maid's uniform had already placed me in a position of invisibility, and tonight that invisibility felt even more pronounced. I moved through the halls quietly, carrying trays, arranging glasses, and serving guests who barely acknowledged my presence. But even as I worked, I was aware of Victoria's energy dominating every corner of the room. She was everywhere at once, greeting guests with confidence, speaking about business matters with authority, and presenting herself as someone deeply involved in decisions that traditionally belonged to Daniel. Daniel himself had just returned from a long business trip earlier that day. He looked tired but still attentive, trying to reconnect with the flow of what was happening in his home. I noticed how he observed conversations carefully, as if sensing that something had shifted during his absence, but not yet understanding what it was. Victoria stayed close to him in a way that felt strategic, constantly guiding conversations and introducing topics that subtly directed attention toward her influence in the company. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere became more relaxed on the surface, but underneath it, tension was building. I could feel it in the way Victoria interacted with me. She looked at me occasionally, not with anger, but with a kind of satisfaction, as if waiting for the right moment to complete a final act she had been preparing for a long time. I continued serving silently, keeping my expression neutral, reminding myself that observing carefully was more important than reacting emotionally. Then came the moment that changed everything. During the middle of the dinner, when conversation and laughter were at their peak, Victoria suddenly raised her glass. The sound of her voice cut through the room instantly. Every guest turned toward her expecting a toast or announcement. She stood confidently, holding the attention of everyone present without effort. I stopped moving, still holding a tray, sensing that something important was about to happen. She began speaking in a calm but deliberate tone, introducing herself as someone deeply committed to maintaining the legacy of the Morrison family. She spoke about responsibility, control, and trust. The words sounded formal at first, almost respectable, but then her tone shifted slightly, and I realized she was no longer simply making a speech. She was setting a stage. Her eyes slowly moved toward me, and then she said it. "This woman is not my daughter-in-law. She is just a housemaid we are kind enough to keep." For a moment, there was silence. Not immediate laughter. Not immediate reaction. Just silence, as if the room needed time to process what had been said. Then, slowly, some guests began to smile awkwardly, unsure whether to take it seriously or treat it as humor. A few laughed lightly, following Victoria's lead. That laughter spread, not because it was funny, but because people often follow the reaction of authority in uncertain situations. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room shift toward me. It was not just humiliation, it was public redefinition. In a single sentence, Victoria had reduced my identity in front of people who mattered in Daniel's world. I could feel my heart beating strongly, but my face remained controlled. Years of discipline and silence had trained me not to react in ways that would give her satisfaction. Daniel, however, did not laugh. He looked confused at first, as if he was trying to understand whether this was some kind of private joke he was not aware of. His eyes moved from Victoria to me, then back again. That moment of confusion was important. It showed that he was not fully aware of the reality that had developed in his absence. Victoria continued speaking, reinforcing her statement as if to make it official in front of everyone. She described me as someone who had misunderstood her place in the house, someone who needed guidance, and someone who was being kept out of respect rather than acceptance. Every word was carefully chosen to maintain her image, while deepening the humiliation she had already initiated. I stood still, holding the tray, refusing to show emotion. Inside, however, I was no longer absorbing humiliation in the same way. Something inside me had already shifted long before this moment. I was not reacting like a victim anymore. I was observing like someone who had already started preparing for what came next. That was when I slowly placed the tray down and took a step forward. The room did not immediately understand what I was doing. Conversation slowed again. Eyes followed me carefully. I could feel the tension shift from Victoria to me for the first time that evening. And in that silence, I knew the moment she had been building toward had finally opened the door for everything that would follow. The silence in the room after Victoria's words did not last long, but it felt heavy enough to freeze time for a few seconds. Everyone expected me to either break down or walk away quietly, just as Victoria had always assumed I would. But this time, something was different. I did not move in panic, and I did not react with emotion. Instead, I stood still, looking at the faces around the table, and then slowly turned my attention toward Daniel. For the first time in a long time, I saw confusion turning into realization in his eyes, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally beginning to connect in his mind. I took a small step forward, not toward Victoria, but toward the center of the room where everyone could see clearly. My hands were steady, even though my heart was beating heavily. From the folder I had quietly carried earlier, I placed a simple black file on the dining table. It did not look dramatic, but its contents were enough to change everything that had been built over the years. The sound of it hitting the table was soft, but it carried a weight that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Daniel looked at the file first. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. As he began to read, I watched his expression carefully. At first there was confusion, then slight disbelief, then something deeper shock that slowly turned into anger. Inside the file were documents I had collected over time, including financial records that did not match official reports, copies of signatures that were not consistent with Daniel's own handwriting, and communication logs that showed unauthorized involvement in business decisions. Alongside these were recorded conversations I had carefully preserved, conversations that revealed how much control Victoria had slowly taken while Daniel was away. As he turned each page, his breathing became more uneven. He looked up at Victoria once, as if silently asking for an explanation, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, her face remained tense, her confidence beginning to crack for the first time. The guests around the table started to sense that this was no longer a simple family matter. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to discomfort as they realized that what they were witnessing was something far more serious. Victoria finally spoke, trying to regain control of the situation. She dismissed the documents as misunderstandings and accused me of manipulation. Her voice was still strong, but it lacked the earlier certainty. She attempted to explain her involvement as necessary management in Daniel's absence, presenting herself as someone who had only acted in the interest of the family business. But every word she spoke now sounded defensive rather than authoritative. Daniel interrupted her, his voice sharper than before. He asked direct questions, pointing out inconsistencies in the records and demanding clarity. It was the first time he had spoken to her in that tone in front of others. The balance of power in the room had begun to shift visibly. Victoria tried to respond, but the confidence she once carried so easily was now breaking apart under scrutiny. One of the investors present at the table quietly asked to review the documents as well. That small request opened the door for others to do the same. The room that had once been filled with polite conversation and admiration now turned into a space of silent analysis and growing concern. The more the documents were reviewed, the clearer the situation became. What Victoria had described as harmless involvement appeared to be a structured takeover of authority that had been carried out gradually and without transparency. Daniel eventually closed the file and looked at Victoria again. This time, there was no confusion in his expression. There was disappointment, anger, and a sense of betrayal that could not be hidden. He asked her directly whether she had authorized these actions without his knowledge. The question hung in the air heavily, and for the first time, Victoria did not have an immediate answer. She tried to regain control by shifting attention back to me, accusing me of plotting against her. But this time the reaction from the room was different. People were no longer reacting to her words with trust. They were comparing her claims with the evidence they had just seen. The authority she once held in the room was no longer automatic. It had to be justified, and she was failing to do so. Daniel made a decision in front of everyone. He asked for legal counsel to be contacted immediately and instructed that all business accounts and decisions linked to the disputed activities be reviewed. His voice was firm, no longer uncertain. The decision was no longer emotional, it was procedural. And that made it final. Victoria looked at him, realizing for the first time that she was losing control of everything she had carefully built. The power dynamic that had defined the house for years collapsed in moments. The guests began to leave quietly, sensing that the situation was no longer appropriate for their presence. As security was eventually called to escort Victoria out, she turned one last time toward me. There was anger in her eyes, but beneath it was something else. Recognition that she had underestimated the one person she had chosen to ignore completely. Daniel did not look away as she was taken out. His focus remained on the reality that had been uncovered in front of him. The house that had once been ruled by silent authority was now empty of its illusion of control, and everything that followed that moment carried the weight of irreversible change. What began as humiliation inside a cold mansion slowly turned into a carefully built game of patience, observation, and truth. She was reduced to nothing in their eyes yet. That was exactly where her real power began. Every insult she endured, every moment she stayed silent, and every secret she uncovered led to a final confrontation no one in that house was prepared for. In the end, it was not anger that brought justice, but strategy, proof, and quiet strength that turned the entire story upside down.